And no one's really speaking about it, but very clearly, because of her high-risk status, they thought that she may well have taken her own life. The reality is, though, is that could she have gone in this water and committed suicide? And what I would say is that that is almost impossible. How did she end up in a depth in the middle where she could end up dying? Because if she'd come down the side here, it's so short, so shallow, she couldn't have died.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. A detective seems to think Nicola Bulley simply could not have committed suicide. Why? Because the water was too shallow. That's his reason. But does that make sense? I'd like to offer two intertextual examples to at least compare to the Nicola Bulley case. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, during the night of 19 July 1965, in the middle of winter in South Africa, very close to Cape Town, Ingrid Jonker, a world-famous poet, she went down to the beach at Three Anchor Bay, and I've obviously been there before. In Cape Town, it's got a beautiful view of Table Mountain, and she walked into the sea and committed suicide by drowning. What does that tell you? It's got nothing to do with how shallow the water is. It has everything to do with intent. And also how cold the water is. If you've ever been to Three Anchor Bay, if you've ever been to that part of Cape Town, you've got a view of Robben Island there. It's very cold. You might be more familiar with Virginia Woolf than Ingrid Jonker. Virginia Woolf's a world-famous British author who, shortly after the commencement of the Second World War, was also struggling with depression. Like Jonker, Woolf also walked into a river and drowned. On the 28th of March 1941, Virginia Woolf drowned herself by filling her overcoat pockets with stones, and then she walked into the River Ouse near her home. Her body was not found until 18 April. In Woolf's case, it took exactly 3 weeks to find her body, even though she'd simply walked into the river. And despite the fact that there were no attempts to hide her body, like the Wire, the River Ouse is tidal and relatively short. The Wire is 48 miles long. The Ouse, is it Ouse or Ouse? The Ouse is 35 miles long, and it's in Sussex. It washes out into the south coast of England. Because both rivers drain into the sea, both rivers are necessarily tidal. It just means that they've got a lot more energy in them than a normal river. The wash is more vigorous. I think the mistake the detective is making is trying to imagine that Nicola had to have drowned right in front of the bench. I don't think Virginia Woolf drowned right where she left her walking stick. What is more likely is that Nicola didn't succumb because of the depth of the water column, but she succumbed due to the temperature of the water. And I almost died that same way. I almost succumbed during a mile swim, a mile out and a mile back in the sea of Clifton Fourth Beach when I was a teenager. The water then was supposed to be 11 degrees Celsius. The water that Nicola was in was about half of that, I think 6 degrees Celsius. The cold water and that process may have taken anything from 5 to 30 minutes. To be clear, in both intertextual cases, the critical factor wasn't how deep or shallow or fast moving the water, but how cold that water was, and then also the intent of the person who walked into that water. Virginia Woolf drowned in late winter, early spring. Ingrid Jonker in the middle of winter. And then Nicola looks like also the middle of winter. Now let's go through Virginia Woolf's narrative in more detail. And what I want you to think about is how Virginia Woolf's story may, to some extent, correspond with Nicola's. And possibly Nicola's story corresponds with certain aspects of Virginia's narrative. So this is the official story, that the housekeeper explained that she went about her housework. Leonard, that is almost the Paul Ansel of that story, Leonard, Virginia's husband, asked the housekeeper to give Virginia a feather duster so that she could help clean. And the whole point of that was to keep her busy, right? and that came from the book Leonard Woolf, a biography. He said, I gave her a duster, gave the housekeeper a duster, but it seemed very strange. I'd never known her to want to do any housework with me before. The dusting didn't last long for Virginia, as she soon put the feather duster down, and then she went to her writing lodge in the backyard. And what is interesting is Leonard wanted to keep an eye on her regardless. He was trying to find ways to keep her busy, right? You know that saying, idleness is the devil's workshop. And so he went down and visited her in her lodge at 11 a.m. and he saw her writing something, and he took that as a good sign. He took that as a good sign that she was writing, not knowing that she was probably writing a suicide note. One does have the impression that Leonard knew Virginia was vulnerable and did something about it. Didn't Paul know Nicola was vulnerable? Now, during their conversation where Leonard was with Virginia, Virginia actually said to him that she's going to do some housework and then she's going to go for a walk before lunch. And probably Nicola said the same to Paul. I'm going to go and drop the kids off and then I'm going to go for a walk after breakfast. Virginia and Leonard then returned to the house together, and Leonard told her to lie down and rest for half an hour while he went up to study to work. After Leonard went upstairs, the housekeeper said that she saw Virginia go back out to her writing lodge, then return to the house, put on her fur coat and her Wellington boots. She picked up her walking stick and she walked outside towards the front gate. Now, Nicola also wore a big blue coat. Did she have anything in her pockets? According to Virginia's biographer, Hermione Lee, said she suspects that it was either during the first trip to the house with Leonard or the second trip to put on her coat that Virginia left her suicide note, right? And she also left a suicide note to Vanessa, her sister, on the table in the upstairs sitting room. In other words, all of this was premeditated at that time. Virginia knew what she was about to do. She also left a second note to Leonard in her writing lodge, although it's not clear when she placed it there. Now, like Nicola, there were also several witnesses who saw Virginia prior to her disappearance. After Virginia went through the front gate, she went by a church, and then she went on her way down to the River Ouse. Along the way, a villager, a guy called Bert Skinner, he apparently saw Virginia walking, but he didn't think anything was strange about it. He didn't notice anything strange about her behavior. At about 20 minutes to noon, another farm worker, guy called John Hubbard, he was cleaning ditches, and he said that he saw her walking towards the river. But he'd often seen Virginia walking along the river, just as I think a lot of the dog walkers had seen Nicola. But what was different was Virginia usually went in the afternoon, and this wasn't the afternoon. After watching her for a few minutes, he went home for lunch, and that was the last time anyone saw Virginia alive. At about 1 p.m., so around about 10 minutes later, the housekeeper rang the bell for lunch, and Leonard later wrote in his biography that he was outside in the garden thinking that Virginia was in the house. When Leonard went upstairs to the lounge to listen to the news, he found the two suicide notes addressed to him and Vanessa. And then this is quite interesting. What did he do after that? After reading the one addressed to him, Leonard ran down the stairs shouting for the housekeeper. And he said that, I think something has happened to Mrs. Woolf. I think she may have tried to kill herself. Leonard then searched the house and the garden while the housekeeper ran to fetch a friend, a guy called Percy Bartholomew, who then located the village policeman. Right? They immediately ran to the river where Virginia was known to take walks. You kind of get the idea that Paul didn't immediately go to the river. He first kind of changed his clothing. Anyway, once there, Leonard found Virginia's footprints and walking stick on the riverbank, but there was no sign of her. So instead of a dog harness and a phone, they found footprints and a walking stick. Some of the men dove into the water. I'd like to know whether Paul did something like that. And while others brought tackle and ropes to dredge the river. According to Lee, Leonard searched the surrounding area for any sign of her. And so Leonard thought Virginia may have gone up to the ruin they called Mad Misery, and they went to have a look there, and they searched for her along the water meadows, the river bank, the brooks, until it was night time. They searched from about lunchtime until the sun set, and then they had to give up. Now compare that to Paul, who I think searched, was it for 20 minutes? Quite a difference. Then Vanessa came, Virginia's sister, and Leonard told her the catastrophic news. Every single day, including this one, Leonard entered into his diary. So every day from that day onwards, the mileage of his car plus the mileage that day, which on March 28 was 13, taking Vanessa back to Charleston. The rest of the space is obscured by a brownish yellow stain, which they thought could be coffee or tea or tears. So you very much do get a sense that Leonard is very emotional. He is very upset by something he doesn't actually know has happened, but he's nevertheless very upset. Later that evening, Leonard found the second suicide note Virginia had left for him. He examined it, and he believed that it was that he was reading Virginia's writing, and he believed that that was what she was doing that morning when he visited her in the lodge. She was actually writing that suicide note. The notes hinted that Virginia was going to kill herself, but didn't say how or where. Little did Virginia herself realize that the river she planned to drown herself in would basically carry her away and prevent family from finding her for 3 whole weeks, right? And I'm quoting this from the website Zazorama. I'll put a link to that in the description. And so the aftermath was exactly the same as in the Nicola Bulley case. Virginia Woolf had disappeared. Nobody knew where she was. They didn't know if she was alive or not. They presumed that she wasn't alive. And then some articles came out saying Mrs. Woolf is presumed to be dead. She went for a walk last Friday, leaving a letter behind, and it is thought that she had been drowned. Her body, however, has not been recovered. The article confirmed that Virginia was missing, but states the police were not investigating her disappearance. In other words, the police didn't assume it to be foul play. And so you had the same situation, although in this case there was little doubt that Virginia Woolf had killed herself. There was no body, no evidence, no funeral, and no closure for friends, family, or her readers. Interestingly, the view of one person, Vita Sackville West, said, she thought that it was best if her body was never found, and hoped that it was instead carried out to sea so that her loved ones would never have to face it. But Virginia's body was eventually discovered. 3 weeks later, 3 weeks after the incident, some children made the gruesome discovery when Virginia's body washed up near the bridge at Southeast. On April 19, the Associated Press announced to the public Mrs. Woolf's body found and confirmed that she drowned herself. The article also hinted that the ongoing World War II may have played a part in her suicide. In other words, there was a process that preyed on her heart and mind over time. Her one home was bombed during World War II, and then another home was bombed as well. And so it was obvious that Virginia Woolf had been depressed for a considerable length of time. So how much of that story corresponds with this one? Do you also think that it is virtually impossible that Nicola committed suicide? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.